Hey, it's Dr. Asatar Bear, and in this video, I'm going to be talking about 10 of what I think of as the major criticisms of capitalism. So let's start with the first one, all right? The idea that capitalism is based on exploitation, all right? And exploitation, we're talking about the Marxist definition. Exploitation exists when the surplus value of a person's labor is taken by someone else, right? Somebody other than the direct producer. So to get a better sense of what this is, okay, we can consider historical modes of production, such as slavery, okay? So under slavery, the slave's labor in the production process can be divided into two different parts, okay? That part, which is called necessary labor, right? That part of their labor which produces the food, clothing, shelter, etc., which goes to sustain the slaves. Okay, that could either be producing these things directly, maybe growing the crops, making the clothing, producing the shelter, perhaps, or it could be producing value, which is then used to purchase these things. But either way, that portion of the slave's labor is necessary labor, right? That is needed to sustain the slaves. Okay, so that part goes to the slaves. We often overlook this, but a portion of the slave's labor does have to sustain the slave, otherwise the slaves will die, right? But what happens to the rest of it? Well, the rest of it is surplus labor. It produces value which is above the necessary, and that value becomes the profits of the slave owners, of the masters. That is slavery, right? Is it exploitative? Absolutely, right? Of course it involves exploitation. At this point in history, we all understand this, right? If you want to show that a society is wrong or bad, immoral, all you have to do is say, well, they own slaves, right? You get nearly universal agreement that that's bad. What about feudalism? How does this work? Does this involve exploitation? Well, here we have the serfs' labor. Okay, they're going through a production process. Historically, this usually involved agriculture, and the way this worked is that the serfs would perform necessary labor. They would grow crops 3 days a week on a piece of land which they had a traditional right to farm. This is called the serf's tenure. That portion of the products of their labor would go to the serfs themselves, right? So in other words, they would live off the crops that they grew on their tenure. But they did more work than that. They also grew crops a certain number of days of the week or year on the lord's domain, a different piece of land belonging to their feudal lord. The crops that were grown on that land was taken by the lord. Now, this form of production changed over time and developed later into a monetary rent that was paid to what were then called landlords. But it has a feudal history, right? Does this kind of production involve exploitation? Absolutely, of course it does, right? The serfs are working for someone else, even on a different piece of land for free. Now, we get a new form of production in capitalism. What happens here? Well, workers' labor goes through the production process, right, is added to the value of the equipment and raw materials and tools that are used, etc. And a portion of that labor can be understood to be necessary labor, that is producing the value which ends up being paid to the worker in the form of wages. Okay, so that portion of their labor goes toward their wages. But workers also perform surplus labor, that is, they produce additional value, which then goes to capitalists and becomes profits. That's the basis of gross profit. So is capitalism based on exploitation? Yes, it is. Of course it is, right? There would be no profits under capitalism without exploitation. This is unfair and immoral, right? So the exploitation of capitalism is different in character from that of feudalism or slavery. They're based on different societies with different rules, different laws, different customs, etc. But the result is the same, okay? A few control vast sums of wealth that's produced by others, right? it leads to a society of alienation, fear, and greed. The few who own the means of production, okay, that is the land and other capital which is used to produce, that's the means of production, they use the surplus to keep their wealth and power. It has nothing to do with for the good of all or whatever, of course not, right? They use it in such a way so that their position continues. All right, point two. Capitalism is based on enormous structural violence and death. Now, because the means of production are privately owned, markets come to dominate all forms of distribution, and what that means is if you can't afford the goods and services necessary to live, then you die. This is a simple truth of the matter, all right? Now, what does that result in? Well, that results in about 9 million people die of starvation or malnutrition each and every year, despite, at this point, a global food surplus. So 820 million people experience chronic hunger each year. I just want to point out there's a difference here between dying of starvation, right, that's 9 million people a year, versus those that are experience hunger. You can experience chronic hunger and live through that, right? So 9 million deaths per year, a lot more than that, right? 820 million people go hungry each year. But in either case, right, that's a huge amount of death and suffering. 3.5 additional million people per year die due to lack of access to clean water, and that includes due to all of the problems that go along with that. That is infection, disease caused by lack of sanitation. 3.5 million people. These are very easily preventable problems, okay? Like I said, the world produces enough food to feed everyone. We could, with actually not that large expenditure relative to the grand scheme of things, make sure that everyone has clean water. We don't, right? Why not? Well, because these things are considered not rights, but things you buy, privileges, okay? So that's capitalism, right? Another 1.5 million people die each year due to vaccine-preventable illnesses, okay? So again, these things, it wouldn't cost that much money. Why don't we do it? Because most of the people who die are poor, and this is capitalism, right? If you can't sell something, there's no benefit to doing it. So if we just count this up, okay, we take these average numbers, let's just look at the last 30 years. The global death toll of capitalism was at least 420 million people who would not have otherwise died from these things, okay? This is a very conservative estimate that leaves out many millions of deaths due to factors like lack of medical care or warfare. The wars of the imperial powers caused tens of millions of deaths during the 20th century alone. So this is a hugely lowball estimate of the deaths of capitalism. The point is it causes a tremendous amount of death, which is unnecessary. This death toll is largely invisible. There is no person or nation or policy that is singly responsible. There's nobody that you could look to and say, that person is the one who killed hundreds of millions of people. They're victims of structural violence, and that's hard for us to understand because we're very tuned into acts of individual violence, right? Like, this dude shot this other dude, right? Okay, we can understand that. We can wrap our minds around that. Structural violence is these deaths occurred because nobody did anything about it, right? But they're deaths nonetheless, right? They're deaths that are attributable to the system itself. Point 3, capitalism leads to growth in the rich countries and colonial subjugation and underdevelopment in the rest of the world. So here's a map, all right? And this is just showing the colonial possessions of the various imperial powers, all right? And we can see that the imperial powers carved up most of the world, right? And this is over the course of a few hundred years. But the world as we know it now is the product of that colonial domination, which occurs at the same time as capitalism is developing. And not only does it occur at the same time that capitalism is developing, it feeds this new system and provides a tremendous amount of capital for that development to take place. So by 1900, European capitalist countries had conquered the world. Imperialism was wedded to capitalism, the growth of trade, and the desire to control emerging markets. And imperialism was supported by, and in turn accelerated, racism and Eurocentrism. Imperialism built on the foundation of modern global trade, that is the triangular trade of slavery, sugar, timber, and other raw materials, and guns and other manufactured goods. Though many countries decolonized in the mid to late 20th century, unequal trade relationships and underdevelopment persisted, okay? And this shaped the entire modern world. Like I said, the basis of modern international trade is the slave trade that begins in the early 16th century and takes place between Europe, especially the port centers of Europe, okay, Africa, and the New World, particularly the East Coast and these Caribbean countries known as the West Indies at the time. Now, after decolonization, imperialism became much more market-based, okay? So decolonization meant that the political power shifted back to local authorities, but the economic relationships remained intact. The property rights from the colonial period were largely unchallenged, even though Europeans had completely illegally, by force, seized control of most of the land and other natural resources. That was not changed in any significant way through decolonization, except in only a few minor cases. Okay, a few countries changed that, but mostly, most of the property rights, most of the control of assets and other real property remained the same as it was when these countries had been colonized. Economic development could not take place without capital accumulation and investment. The rich countries provided this through the International Monetary Fund, that's the IMF, and the World Bank after 1945. But this was debt-based, right? It trapped countries in a cycle of dependency and underdevelopment and continued on the path of countries producing raw materials and importing finished manufactured goods, keeping these countries poor and underdeveloped. All right, point 4, capitalism leads to war. Capitalism has produced more war, more bloodshed than any other system, absolutely bar none, okay? The deadliest conflicts of the 20th century were wars between imperial powers. We're talking about World War I, about 20 million deaths estimated, okay, about 50% of those civilians. World War II, the range here is a little bit broad, but 60 to 78 million deaths, almost 2/3 of those civilians. And the Russian Civil War from 1918 to 1920, 13.5 million deaths, 85% civilians. Now, this is a civil war which has very heavy interference and funding from the capitalist nations. This is, of course, associated with the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution. But right after the Bolshevik Revolution, 14 capitalist nations invaded Russia. Basically, you know, they worked with existing pro-monarchist groups and so forth, the White Russians, etc. But the point is, this was a very heavy death toll. The war engulfed the entire country, destabilized it, and led to millions and millions of deaths. Now, the biggest contributor to global war since 1945 has been the United States, which has been at war, whether that war has been declared or undeclared, continuously since 1941, and is the world's largest exporter of weaponry. The U.S. maintains military bases all over the world. Okay, so here's a couple of the conflicts since World War II. Okay, we got World War II itself. Most people have heard of that one. The Korean War, again, that's pretty well known. The Laotian Civil War, much less well known. Okay, but this goes on for 20 years. Lebanon crisis, the Bay of Pigs invasion, the Simba rebellion in the Congo, the Vietnam War. We're familiar with that one in the United States. The communist insurgency in Thailand. The Korean DMZ conflict, the Gulf War, the Iraq War, the Iraqi no-fly zone enforcement, the Bosnian War, the war in Afghanistan. There are 30 more, just post-World War II, wars or conflicts, military actions, involving the United States. Okay, the United States is the single greatest obstacle to world peace. This is the global network of 800 plus military bases that the United States maintains at tremendous expense. And you'll notice that these span the globe, right? This is what modern imperialism looks like. All right, point 5. The alienation and exploitation of capitalism leads to a lot of the other divisions that we look at in society: racism, sexism, and other social divisions. Capitalism is extremely divisive. Capitalism takes existing hierarchies like patriarchy and turbocharges them, even as it destroys others, like it has with traditional religion. Racism was produced by the conflict between the economics of slavery and the democratic ideals of equality. Okay, so modern liberalism, as we know it, the belief in liberty, has always had this conflict. Okay, like, how can we believe on the one hand that all men are created equal, and on the other hand have slaves, which are obviously not in equality, they're not voting, etc., right? Now, those who are outside the norm of the power structure, so that is female, non-white, non-European, LGBTQ+, etc., suffer far worse economic outcomes in terms of wages, income, wealth, unemployment, etc., along with political repression, for example, police violence and incarceration, and so forth, right? That is capitalism as we know it. Now, it's brought to its kind of highest point in the United States, but this is to some extent true in every capitalist nation. Marginalized communities act as internal colonies, okay, within each country. Colonialism takes place within a capitalist nation as well as outside of it, okay, as well as without. So rural communities, the ghettos of cities, marginalized communities form the periphery. They're outside the power structure that forms the core. Wealth is then extracted from the periphery and concentrated in the core through a variety of different means, but including things like rent, interest, monopoly pricing, lack of access to the means of production. All right, point 6. Capitalism corrupts democracy. Capitalism undermines and corrupts democracy. Now, capitalism's long and complex relationship with voting. On the one hand, the rise of liberal democracy has gone along with the rise of capitalism and swept away the feudal aristocracy of the past. On the other hand, capitalism continuously produces inequality and deprivation, which is inimical to democracy. Like, would you vote to starve to death? Right? Nobody would, right? Of course not. Would you vote to be, in a state of complete deprivation? No. So modern capitalism assaults democracy at every turn, producing structures that look democratic, but aren't really. So if we take a look at U.S. history, we can consider, for example, the U.S. Constitution with its many compromises which undermine democracy, looking at, for example, the 3/5 Compromise to the slave states, and the exclusion of women, slaves, Native Americans, etc. from the franchise. That is a lot of categories that people could not vote. So voting was actually only for a very small minority. The Electoral College and the Senate were explicitly designed to decrease the power of the popular vote. Now, after the Civil War, the Jim Crow system narrowed the voting franchise by introducing poll taxes and later voter registration. The percentage of people voting out of those eligible steadily fell. The franchise was widened, which raised the total percentage of the population who could vote, yet at the same time the non-voter came to dominate, right? Now that's not an accident. That's been created by design. So here's a graph here, and it shows this is the U.S. popular vote as a percentage of the total population. Okay, so we start off, let's look early in U.S. history and see what percentage of the population is actually voting for the president. And answer, not very much, right? I mean, we get into the early 1800s, right? There's 1820, and it's less than 5% this entire period, right? Because there's a lot of restrictions on the franchise, right? Those who have an actual vote, it's a very small number, okay? So this begins to change. We see, as the 1800s progress, there's a lot of populist movements that take place, and these raise the percentage, okay, of people who are voting pretty substantially, okay, going from from 5% to, by the end of the century, to about 20%. Okay, so this is a period where there's a tremendous amount of, the percentage of the registered voters who actually vote is very, very high, right? Much, much higher than today. Now, at the same time, like I said, the franchise is very limited. So, the most obvious way that it's limited is that women can't vote, right? Now, that changes in the beginning of the 20th century, okay? So the early 20th century, the 1920s, this is the period, 19 teens and 20s, this is the period of the women's suffrage movement, okay? That movement is successful, the women gain the right to vote, and that increases the percentage of the population that votes fairly substantially, right? Just that one change, okay? Now, at the same time, we have Jim Crow and other things which are working to practically restrict the franchise. What happens is the percentage of eligible voters, right, even though the percentage of the population increases, the percentage of the eligible voters, who actually vote, right, declines quite a bit, okay? So we end up, these two forces kind of converge, and we end up with a kind of flattening, okay? So we in the modern period, right, that like the post-World War II period, we're in here, okay? So that is the total proportion of the population ends up voting for the president is somewhere between this like 35% to 45% band, all right, in the modern era. Now, that's not really democracy, right? I mean, like we have very limited options in terms of voting, and most people do not exercise that option, even in the biggest vote, the one that receives the most attention and so forth, which is the vote for president, right? You can't really call that a real democracy. Now, one of the reasons perhaps that people don't vote is because they wonder, does it make a difference, right? And the answer, according to this study, is no, not really. It doesn't really make a difference, right? So this graphic says who holds the reins of democracy. Bars show how much each group's preference on public policy are actually represented in Congress's decisions, right? So this is basically looking at if citizens have a majority interest in something, right? They either like a policy or dislike it. What are the chances that that gets passed or gets repealed? And the chances are pretty slight, okay? They're about 5%. Even if there's a very strong majority position, does that mean it gets passed? Like example, we have a very strong majority that supports health care for all, something like Medicare for all, or whatever it's called, right? Universal health care in the United States. Every industrial nation has this except for the United States. Very, very strong supermajority support of that. Do we have that? No. Are we close to having that? I don't think so. No, not at this point, not in 2020, even with the global pandemic, which is, at the time that I'm recording this video, the COVID-19 crisis. What about if interest groups support something? Does that have a chance of passing? Well, it is a much higher chance, okay, than if the majority of citizens, because interest groups are more organized, right? What if the wealthy support something? The top 10%? Well, that has a very good chance of passing, right? Well, we have democracy for the rich, right? What if business groups want something? Well, it's got a decent chance of happening, right? We've got overlap between these, of course, right? Because the wealthy and business groups are often see eye to eye. That's who holds the reins of democracy. All right, point 7. Markets under capitalism are not competitive. Large corporations gain and keep monopoly power, right? They use that power to rip us off. So in the last 2 decades, over 75% of U.S. industries have experienced an increase in what's called concentration levels, right? This is a measure of how concentrated, that is, how many companies are there in a given industry. So this gets to be a little bit technical, but what we can see here is a pretty strong upward trend here in how concentrated these different industries are, right? We look at manufacturing or non-manufacturing, and we can see there's concentration taking place just even over the last 20 or 30 years here. All right, next point, capitalism is unstable, okay? It has destructive cycles of growth and contraction. Very old criticism of capitalism, right? And the idea here is that this cycles of growth and contraction, what's called the business cycle, is very damaging to society, Okay, so here's a placard that this guy is wearing. This is during the Great Depression. It says, "I know 3 trades, I speak 3 languages, fought for 3 years, have 3 children, and no work for 3 months, but I only want 1 job," right? Just showing that if you don't have a job, everything else becomes very, very difficult, all right? So recessions, of course, cause all sorts of social ills, from unemployment to home foreclosure to business failures. They shatter people's dreams and their stability. Nearly every social ill that we can measure on a social scientific basis, from crime rates to mental illness to stress, depression, suicide, goes up when the unemployment rate goes up. So, wow, what an enormous negative for society. We would think we would want to abolish that, or at least minimize it, in the same way that we try to minimize other social ills. But we can see there's a pretty strong cyclical basis to the unemployment rate. That is, there are times when the unemployment rate spikes, right? These are associated with recessions. The recessions, by the way, in the official economics term, right, are a very different thing from, even though unemployment might remain elevated for a good period of time afterwards, where like the width of this spike is actually much greater than the shaded portion, okay? So then that's true for pretty much every recession. That is, even if the economy begins to grow again at this point, we end up with a lengthy period of abnormally high unemployment. And the most significant of those, certainly in the modern era, is the Great Recession that begins in 2008, right? So the recession itself is relatively brief, but in terms of unemployment, its effects are extremely long-lasting, right? We have over 6% inflation for a lengthy period of time, right? For over 5 years. That's pretty remarkable, right? In terms of these recessions, many of the others in U.S. history were much shorter. The point is, right, unemployment, the cyclical nature of capitalism, is highly destructive, and it's not going anywhere. That's its entire history. Okay, so point 9 is capitalism is wasteful and inefficient. And this is in contrast to the dogma that says that capitalism is the most efficient system ever. Not the case, right? Capitalism wastes a huge amount of society's resources if that waste is profitable, right? Capitalism is, everything is on the basis of profit. So if it's profitable to waste, then you're going to waste, right? If it's more profitable to waste a resource than it is to reclaim it or reuse it or recycle it or whatever, then that resource is going to get wasted, right? 99 times out of 100 it's going to get wasted. Okay, let's take a look at a resource like just extra food. Okay, so in the United States, about 40% of the food that is produced goes to waste. 40%, right? Amazing. So why don't we just give it away to people who are hungry? Well, that's not capitalism, right? Capitalism is the profit motive. Where's the profit in giving something away, right? If you give it away, you're going to hurt your market. There's going to be some people who don't buy it as a result, right? You can't possibly give something of value away. That's going against the logic of markets. Here's a quote about this from Magdoff and Williams, who say, "Waste is also a routine byproduct of capitalist tendency to overbuild capacity in good times, assuming that growth will continue at its same trajectory. The company that overbuilds capacity eventually comes up against a much lower cost producer or mistaken market possibilities or a recession, leading to abandoned factories and stores that are then repurposed, torn down, or just left to decay. Abandoned or torn down facilities such as steel mills, clothing factories, movie theaters, and malls represent a huge waste of resources. You can't possibly spend time in the United States or any other industrial country without seeing, the wastage, the wreckage, the burned out towns, the abandoned buildings that accumulate under capitalism." What about planned obsolescence? This is when products are intentionally created to become obsolete, just to be replaced by the new model, right? No one benefits from you using the same washing machine or car or computer or phone, whatever it is, for years and years, even if it's still perfectly functional, the profit is in getting you to buy a new one, right? So we have all sorts of sneaky ways to try to make the one that you bought already obsolete, try to make it less functional, try to make it stop functioning, stop performing the function for which you bought it. Very, very common. What about unproductive guard labor? So this is from a piece by Bowles and Jaidev. And here's their quote. Another dubious first for America. We now employ as many private security guards as high school teachers, over 1 million of them, or nearly double their number in 1980. And that's just a small fraction of what we call guard labor. In addition to private security guards, that means police officers, members of the armed forces, prison and court officials, civilian employees of the military, and those producing weapons. A total of 5.2 million workers in 2011. That is a far larger number than we have of teachers at all levels. What is happening in America today is both unprecedented in our history and virtually unique among Western democratic nations. The share of our labor force devoted to guard labor has risen fivefold since 1890, a year when, in case you were wondering, the homicide rate was much higher than today, right? Guard labor, these are jobs which are just dedicated to guarding or controlling access to private property, maintaining the existing distribution of society's resources. From the perspective of society as a whole, that is a waste, right? Anyone who is guarding something is not producing anything, right? So their labor is by definition unproductive. What they are maintaining is a certain distribution of wealth and income. That is, they're making sure that the rich stay rich, okay? That's not productive from a social perspective. That's productive from the perspective of those who like and defend capitalism. The waste and inefficiency of capitalism is hidden in the statistics. A lot of it raises GDP, right? GDP has no category for something being unproductive in this terminology, right? A lot of things raise GDP which are terrible for society. Point 10, capitalism destroys the environment. Now this one is pretty well known, okay? Our economic way of life is just simply not sustainable. We could look at anything we want. We could look at agriculture. We can look at the state of forests, right? That's basically, we're doing massive deforestation. We can look at our topsoil, right? The tremendous loss of topsoil. We could look at our water use. We can look at something like overfishing. We could look at species extinction, climate change. None of these things are sustainable, right? We're increasing pressure on natural ecosystems all the time, right? Here's a graph of annual global temperature from 1850 to 2017. The color scale represents the change in global temperatures covering 1.35 degrees centigrade. So we can see we're seeing a real warming trend here, right? And the more recent years over on the right are seeing much higher average temperatures than what we have in the past. What makes sense from the perspective of profit rarely makes sense from a social or environmental perspective. Okay, so just a little illustration of this. Phoenix, Arizona has over 150 golf courses, and this is what they look like, right? Now, this kind of grass is not at all native to this environment, as you may know. This requires a tremendous amount of resources to maintain, right? Now, does this make any social sense? Not really, right? Does it make environmental sense? Absolutely not. Is it profitable? Yes. Of course it is, right? That's why this is done. Any business that's not profitable is going to end. It's going to go out of business. So what makes sense from a perspective of profit rarely lines up with what makes sense for the environment. So we have different schools of thought here, and we have different, views of capitalism, right? We have the conservative view of neoclassical economics, of microeconomics, that focuses on this idea that free market competitive capitalism produces an ideal economy which is efficient, which maximizes society's happiness or utility. Capitalism doesn't need regulation, it's self-regulating, okay? Now, obviously, the criticisms that I've given in this lecture are very much at odds with this conservative, neoclassical, or neoliberal position that you find coming from microeconomics. Um, they would explain all of the things that I mentioned as problems that result from lack of competition, no matter how much of a stretch that might be. Um, Okay, then we have the liberal kind of view, which comes out of Keynesian economics, known as macroeconomics, introductory level in colleges and universities. And this view is that capitalism doesn't work well on its own. It has to be regulated by wise government officials to reach its potential, and if it's left unregulated, it will fail. Um, so, to say well-regulated capitalism is the best economic system that we can get, right? So we've got a difference of opinion here between the conservative and the liberal position. Should we have free markets or should we have regulated markets? Right? They're both highly pro-capitalist, but the liberal position is we might need to make a few reforms to capitalism. We might need to regulate it to solve some of the problems that were mentioned in this presentation, versus the conservative position tends to be markets work fantastically well on their own. All we need to do is just get out of the way. Okay, the radical position found within Marxism is that capitalism is simply a failure. It cannot be reformed, just as slavery cannot be made morally acceptable, right? Like can we have a better form of slavery? No, right? It's still slavery. It's morally unacceptable. Same thing with capitalism. We have to create a new economic system, socialism, which can lead us to a society that's based on sharing and cooperation for the benefit of all. Now, it might take us some time to get there, right? The society that we're ultimately trying to create would be called communism, and socialism would be a kind of bridge that would take us there, would provide for economic development, would help society to transition. But the basic argument here is that capitalism is an immoral, an evil economic system that should not continue in much the same way as feudalism and slavery. These were mistakes of history, right? Or things that we have grown beyond as a human species. So that's my presentation. Thank you very much.